There is a particular kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. I know this because I grew up with it. I am 47 years old, the youngest of 4 children, and the only girl. In the country where I was born and raised, that combination, youngest, female, surrounded by brothers, comes with a specific set of expectations written in invisible ink across your entire life. You are expected to be soft, grateful, obedient. You are expected to stay close to home, marry someone appropriate, and if you are lucky, not suffer too much. My family was not poor in the way that makes newspapers. We were poor in the way that made every month feel like a math problem we were failing. My father worked independently, odd jobs, small contracts, the kind of work that has no safety net and no retirement fund. My mother did the same, stretching pesos and prayers further than either should reasonably go. There were 4 of us kids, and the house was always too full and never quite enough. I remember being maybe 10 years old, watching my mother count money on the kitchen table with a face that had gone very still and very quiet, the way faces do when emotion has been replaced by pure calculation. I remember thinking, I am not going to live like this. Not in cruelty toward her, I understood even then that she was doing everything she could. But in the simple, animal way that survival instinct speaks to children, there is another way, and I am going to find it. My brothers, all 3 of them, older than me, louder than me, did not seem to feel the same urgency. I loved them. I want to say that clearly and without qualification because everything that comes later will make it complicated, and I need you to understand the love first. I loved my oldest brother's laugh. I loved my second brother's stubbornness. I loved my youngest brother's gentleness, the way he was always the one to check if you were okay. I loved them with the specific fierce love of someone who grew up crowded against 3 other bodies and never quite learned how to need less space than they took up. But they did not go to college. I did. I want you to understand what that cost. Not just the money. Though that was significant, scraped together through scholarships and part-time jobs and a stubbornness that people sometimes mistook for ambition. I want you to understand what it costs a girl from a family like mine to stand in a room full of people who grew up assuming they belonged there, and decide that she belongs there too. It costs something you never fully get back. A kind of ease. A certain lightness. I paid that price gladly. I built a career. I built it slowly, then all at once, the way these things happen when you refuse to stop. I became, by any reasonable measure, successful. I want to be careful here not to make this into a story about money, because it was never about money for me, it was about security, about never watching my mother count coins on a kitchen table again, about being the person in the room who did not have to calculate whether she could afford to be there. I became that person. And then, because I am who I am, I turned around and reached back. Let me tell you about the motorcycle. My surviving brother, I'll call him Marco, though that is not his name, had been struggling to get to work. He lived far from the job site, public transportation was unreliable, and he was losing hours, losing income, losing ground. He mentioned it once, almost in passing, the way people mention things they've decided not to ask for directly. I went home and bought him a motorcycle. Not a grand gesture, not a production. I just handled it, the way I had learned to handle things, quietly and completely. That is the version of the story Marco tells, when he tells it. My sister got me a motorcycle. Which is true. What he does not always include is that this was not a one-time event. It was a pattern that lasted decades. After my oldest brother died, he left behind children. After my youngest brother died. And I want to pause here, because writing the words "my youngest brother died" still requires something from me, still costs me something. Even now, he left behind children too. 3 kids total between them, kids who had lost their fathers and were trying to figure out how to grow up anyway. I thought about my brothers constantly during those years. I thought about what they would have wanted for their children. I thought about the way my oldest brother used to talk about education, how he'd say he wished he'd gone to college, said it without bitterness, just as a fact about his life that he'd made peace with. I thought about my youngest brother's daughter, this girl who was so clearly brilliant it almost hurt to look at, so clearly headed somewhere, if only someone would help her get there. I paid for her college tuition. She is a doctor now. A doctor. I think about that sometimes when everything else in this story feels unbearable. I think about her in her white coat, this girl who lost her father before she'd finished figuring out who she was, and I think, this is what the money was for. This is what the sacrifice was for. I helped Marco with rent during the hard months. I helped him in the ways that don't get listed because they are too small and too constant to itemize. The phone call where he mentioned the water heater was broken and I sent money that afternoon, the school fees for his kids, the times when he said I'm a little short this month and I made up the difference without making it a thing. And my parents. My parents are the center of this story, which is why I've been circling them, approaching slowly, the way you approach something that both draws and frightens you. I paid off their mortgage. I renovated their home. Not once. 3 times, as the years passed and things wore out and the house that had held us all began to age the way everything ages. The 3rd renovation was the most significant. I divided the house so that my parents could rent out one portion and have a steady income. They had no retirement savings. They had worked their whole lives independently, in a country without the social safety nets I would have counted on if I'd stayed. They were going to grow old with nothing. I made it so they had something. I want to be very honest about something here, because I think it matters. I did not do these things to be repaid. Not financially. I did them because they were my parents, because they were struggling, because I had the means and they had the need, and I did not lie awake at night calculating what I was owed in return. That is not the kind of person I am. But there is a difference between not expecting repayment and expecting to be treated with basic dignity. There is a difference between giving freely and being taken for a fool. I did not understand, until recently, that some people cannot tell the difference. My parents are in their late 80s now. Their health is declining in the gradual, relentless way that age declines health, a little more slowly, a little less steadily each time I visit, a little more present tense about the things that used to be hypothetical. On my last visit, I brought up the will. I want to give you the version of me that sat across from my parents that afternoon, because I think you need to understand what I was feeling and what I was asking. I was not asking for myself. Let me say that again, loudly, for the people in the back. I was not asking for myself. I have a house. I have savings. I have a career and a life and a financial situation that does not require an inheritance from a house in a country I no longer live in. What I was thinking about, what I had been thinking about for years, was my nieces and my nephew. The children of my dead brothers. The children who had grown up without fathers, who had made something of themselves against considerable odds, who deserved whatever small foundation might help them get started. The house had been listed under all 4 children. Me, Marco, and our 2 deceased brothers. Legally complicated, yes. Practically, given that 2 of the owners were dead, I knew it needed to be sorted. And my thought was simple, I would give my portion to my brother's kids. That was it. That was the extent of my agenda. Just give my share to the people who needed it most. So I sat down with my parents, in the home I had renovated, in the portion I had made rentable so they could have income, and I said, we should talk about the will. And my mother looked at my father, and something passed between them that I didn't know how to read yet. And they told me. They had already transferred the house. Not to all 4 children, or their heirs. Not in a way that considered my brother's kids. Not in a way that anyone had discussed with me, or consulted me about, or mentioned in passing as something that was being considered. To Marco. And to Marco's youngest son. I sat there and I felt the information arriving in waves, the way bad news arrives, first the facts, then the implications, then the full weight of what those implications mean. I asked them why. My mother said, "You don't need it. You're doing well." My father nodded. And I understood, in a way that I had not fully understood before, that they had been watching me succeed for 20 years and had come to think of my resources as a given, as a utility, like electricity. Something you use without thinking much about it, because it's always there. You don't need it. No. I don't need the house. That is correct. That has never been the point. The point I was struggling to explain while something inside me went very quiet, was that my dead brother's children might need it. That my nieces and nephew had lost their fathers. That the very least, that could have been done was to ensure they were remembered in this family's final accounting. My parents told me, "We've already made our decision. We are not leaving anything to those grandchildren." I asked how this decision had been made without me. I asked when it had been made. I asked Marco directly, sitting there in the room, Marco who had known, Marco who had been part of this, "Did you know?" He said yes. He said there was nothing he could do. I looked at my brother, this man I had bought a motorcycle for, this man whose rent I had helped pay, this man whose daughter I had put through school until she became a doctor. I looked at him and I asked, "You couldn't have told them it wasn't fair? You couldn't have said a word? You couldn't have picked up the phone and called me?" He said there was nothing he could do. I want to stay in that moment for a second, because I think the internet sometimes moves past these moments too fast, toward the verdict, toward the judgment, toward whether someone is the asshole or not. I want to stay in that room, with those people, in that quiet. My brothers are dead. They worked hard and they died. They left children behind who are trying to live in a world that did not make it easy for them. And the family they came from had decided, quietly, deliberately, on a trip I had paid for, that those children didn't count. That they would get nothing. That the house those men were supposed to have a share in would pass entirely to the brother who was alive and his son, and the rest would simply not exist in this accounting. I thought about my youngest brother. His face. His laugh. The specific way he checked if you were okay. I thought about his daughter, the one who is a doctor now. I thought, he will never know she became a doctor. And his parents, the people who raised him, have decided she doesn't deserve to inherit anything from the house he should have owned a portion of. Something inside me finished breaking. Here is the detail that turns this from a painful family story into something colder. 6 months before this conversation, I had given Marco and his wife plane tickets to visit our parents. A gift. I knew he couldn't afford the trip, I knew my parents' health was declining, and I wanted them to have that time together. I gave them the tickets because I am the kind of person who gives people plane tickets because they should have the chance to see their parents. On that trip, on the trip I paid for, is when the house transfer happened. They flew there on my money. They sat with my parents on my money. They signed the paperwork that removed me and my dead brother's children from the inheritance, and they did it on a trip I funded because I thought I was doing something kind. I want to be precise about the specific quality of the feeling I felt when I understood this. It was not rage, exactly. It was something quieter and more total than rage. It was the feeling of a story I had been living revising itself retroactively, of looking back across decades and seeing, suddenly, the different shape that everything took when you understood that you had been managed rather than loved. And then, because the story has one more layer, one more detail that perhaps only I would have noticed, I remembered the list. My parents had a list of repairs they needed done on the house. They had given this list to me during the visit. They wanted the roof looked at. They wanted the kitchen updated. They wanted. And they gave me that list knowing they had already signed the house over to Marco. They were asking me to pay for repairs on a house that they had secretly transferred to my brother, and they intended to keep asking me to pay for things on the reasonable assumption that I wouldn't find out and would just keep sending money because I always had. I drove back to where I was staying and I sat with this for a long time. I want to be honest about the complexity of what I felt. Because this is not a simple story, and the people in it are not simple, and I do not want to tell it in a way that makes it simple. My parents are in their 80s. They grew up in a world with different rules. The logic of she is successful, so she does not need it is not logic born of malice. It is logic born of scarcity, of a worldview formed by a lifetime of not having enough and trying to make sure the most vulnerable people in the immediate circle were covered. Marco has less. Marco is struggling. Of course they gave it to Marco. But my dead brother's children have less too. My dead brother's children have no fathers. My dead brother's children have every claim on this family's legacy that any of us do. The fact that I am successful does not make their claim disappear. The fact that I do not need the money does not mean it should bypass the people who do in favor of the person who is already in the will. And none of this, none of the logic, none of the reasoning, none of it, addresses the most basic thing. They did it behind my back. They made a decision that affected me, that affected my brother's children, that affected this family's future, and they did it secretly, on a trip I paid for, and then they called me to ask for house repairs. I thought about what would have happened if I hadn't asked about the will. I would never have known. I would have kept sending money for the house, for the repairs, for the parents who had quietly ensured I had no legal claim to any of it. Marco would have known, and he would have said nothing, because why would he? The arrangement benefited him entirely. I would have been paying for something that wasn't mine, to people who had cut me out of it, and they were counting on my love for them to keep that arrangement going indefinitely. And I thought about my nieces and my nephew. My dead brother's kids. Who were not consulted. Who were not considered. Who would have been the last to know, possibly never knowing at all, that they had been written out of a family home that their fathers were supposed to have a share in. I thought. I cannot make my parents change their minds. I understand that. They are old, they have made their decision, and I cannot force them to do what is right. That is their choice to live with. But I have choices too. I went back to my parents' house and I told them something. I told them that I would not be funding repairs on a house I do not own and was not consulted about. I told them that the money I had been sending, the regular support, the monthly help, the financial cushion I had been providing for years, I would be redirecting it. Saving it. And when my nieces and nephew were ready to buy homes, I would give it to them. Not because it would replace what they should have inherited. Not as compensation. But in the name of my dead brothers, who were gone but not forgotten, who deserved to have their children remembered by someone, even if that someone was only me. I told Marco that I had nothing more to say to him about money. That we were done in that regard. That I wished him well and that I hoped he had the means to support our parents, since he now had what he needed to do it. My mother cried. My father looked at the floor. Marco said something about how I was being dramatic. I thought about the motorcycle. I thought about the tuition. I thought about the rent money and the renovation and the mortgage and the plane tickets that took him to the notary where he signed the paperwork that cut me out. I said, take care of yourselves. And I left. People ask, am I wrong? Am I the villain here? Did I abandon my elderly parents over money? Here is what I want to say to that. I did not abandon them over money. I spent 20+ years proving that money was never the point for me. I gave freely, consistently, and without keeping score. I did not give in order to be repaid or to secure my inheritance or to have leverage. I gave because they were my family and I had the means and they had the need. What changed is not that I decided to start keeping score. What changed is that I discovered the people I was giving to had been keeping score all along, and in their accounting, I was a resource, not a person. In their accounting, my success meant I had no claim, my brothers' deaths meant their children had no claim, and the fair thing was whatever benefited Marco and Marco's family most. I cannot make them love my dead brother's children the way I do. I cannot make them understand what it means to me to think of those kids inheriting something, anything, from the fathers they lost. I cannot reach inside my parents' worldview and rearrange it. But I can choose where my resources go. I can choose who receives the benefit of what I've built. I can choose to honor my brothers in the only way left available to me. The money I saved for their children, I am not doing it to punish my parents. I am doing it because those kids deserve someone in this family to see them clearly. Because my youngest brother, if he could know his daughter became a doctor, would have wept with pride. Because my oldest brother used to say he wished he'd gone to college, and maybe his grandchildren will go to college, and maybe that will mean something. I think about loyalty a lot lately. About what it means. About how I understood it versus how it was practiced. I thought loyalty meant, you stay. You give. You help. You carry the weight you're capable of carrying because they are yours and you are theirs. I think, for my family, loyalty meant, you give and you don't ask questions. You give and you don't expect to be consulted. You give and you smile and you wire the money and you don't notice the papers being signed while you're waiting for the transfer confirmation to arrive. Those are not the same thing. I am 47 years old. I am the youngest daughter, the only girl, the one who went to college, the one who built the life, the one who sent the money. I am the one who paid for the mortgage and the renovations and the motorcycle and the medical school tuition and the plane tickets that were used against her. I am also the one who walked out of that house knowing exactly who she is and exactly what she will do with that knowledge. My brothers are gone. Their children are not. And as long as I am here, as long as I am able, someone in this family is going to make sure those kids know their fathers are remembered. That is not revenge. That is love. The real kind. The kind that costs something and gives it freely anyway, to the people who actually deserve it. To anyone who has ever given everything to people who took you for granted, you are not wrong for having limits. You are not cruel for protecting yourself. And you are not abandoning anyone. Sometimes you are simply stopping, finally, to acknowledge the person who has been abandoned all along. That person is you.